But we begin tonight with 21 days, 23 hours, and 59 minutes left until polls begin to close on election night. And if anything could possibly be a metaphor for our troubled times, it might be the scene of Trump fans who came to a rally in the Coachella Valley in California on Saturday, not typical MAGA country, and got literally stranded. According to the mayor's office, there were not enough buses to take them back to their cars. I myself am just back from Jamaica and Ghana. Many thanks to Katie Fang and Jason Johnson for holding it down while I was away. One good thing about travel is the perspective that you gain from the people you talk to and from watching international news on how the rest of the world sees us. And what I can tell you from this recent trip is that, we're not looking too great right now. In both countries, my husband Jason and I got multiple earfuls, best summarized as, what in the hell is going on with America? People were genuinely shocked that a geriatric, possibly senile convicted felon, people literally mentioned the 34 counts, is in a near-dead heat with Vice President Kamala Harris. Particularly as Donald Trump, whose own former Joint Chiefs of Staff Chair Mark Milley called fascist to the core, closes his campaign with what can only be described as a mix of incoherent rambling and straight-up Nazism.
One of the papers said on another country that we are an occupied country, and you know what? They're not that wrong. These are among the worst criminals anywhere in the world, and they come from all over. A huge number is coming out of jails in the Congo.
We will defend our civilization. We will not be conquered. We will not be occupied. We will not be invaded. I will rescue California and every town across America that's been invaded and conquered. And we will put these vicious and bloodthirsty criminals in jail or kick them the hell out of the country.
There's also the equally Hitlerian rhetoric that he used to describe American citizens and what might happen on Election Day.
I think the bigger problem are the people from within. We have some very bad people. We have some sick people, radical left lunatics. And I think they're and it should be very easily handled by, if necessary, by National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military, because they can't let that happen.
On the other hand, Vice President Kamala Harris responds the way a normal campaign would, accurately warning voters of the dangers of Trump.
We can already see the harm he's up to as a candidate. Most recently, spreading disinformation in the wake of natural disasters. Blocking real solutions that would stop drug cartels from crossing the border when he tried to kill and did that border security deal. Because you see, Donald Trump cares more about scaring people, creating fear, running on a problem, instead of what real leaders do, which is to participate in fixing problems.
Vice President Harris will have more to say later this hour as we take her speech live from Erie, Pennsylvania. But if it makes no sense to you that a man who vows to march non-white immigrants into U.S. concentration camps at gunpoint and then mass deport them, while calling these immigrants vermin, diseased criminals, murderers, cat eaters, and cannibals, while also vowing to turn American police into death squads and telling his voters that they don't have to vote anymore after he wins, if you are gobsmacked that that guy, who during a deadly pandemic sent COVID tests badly needed by Americans to Vladimir Putin instead, is tied with the sitting vice president who's supported by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Cheneys, well, welcome to the rest of the rational world, who think not just Donald Trump, but maybe America itself has gone mad. It's not just Trump and the sacking of the Capitol, which, trust me, people outside this country have not forgotten. It's the Republicans, federal and state, who are already vowing to refuse to certify the November election unless Trump wins. Add to that the threat that a Republican-controlled Senate would confirm 40-year-old right-wing replacements for Justices Alito and Thomas, meaning a far-right Supreme Court for the rest of our children's lives, plus a national abortion ban and Project 2025, and you have the recipe for a fascist America, not just in 2025, but in 2055. Things are so bad. The House is refusing to come back into session to provide new additional hurricane aid, while at the same time in North Carolina, an armed man was arrested for making threats against FEMA workers, while federal aid workers had to pause working and move because of reports of armed militias, fueled by Trump and other Republicans' wild hurricane disinformation threatening them. At this point, you can't call what Trump is running a campaign. As friend of the show David Corn points out in Mother Jones, what Trump and J.D. Vance and House and Senate Republicans are running is a massive disinformation campaign aimed at warping Americans' reality. And they're doing it with violent, terrifying, and sometimes bizarre conspiracy theories that set the table for maybe armed resistance to a Kamala Harris win or mass acceptance of American fascism. Trump and Republicans, backed by far right-wing billionaires like Elon Musk and right-wing media and anti-woman manosphere podcasts, are creating social media or gaming social media apps like X Twitter in Trump's favor and pumping disinformation into the brains of Trump supporters. Not quite foreign interference, but not exactly different from what Vladimir Putin would do. And in many ways, the disinformation campaign is working. Base Republicans today believe everything from Democrats secretly manipulating the weather from a secret base in Alaska to Trump being incapable of losing this election. He's winning in a landslide. And some Democrats are starting to believe the disinformation, too. Have you noticed how sharply the polls have shifted in Trump's favor over the last couple weeks? With these claims that Trump is surging with Black and Latino voters and leading in every single swing state, according to secret internal polls, despite all the Hitler talk. Yes, this race will be far too close. Because unfortunately, we do have a fascist groundswell in parts of this country, mainly among white men, let's be clear, but in small pockets among Black and brown men, too. This happens to be a global phenomenon as women become more economically independent and seek positions of power. But friend of the show Simon Rosenberg points out that just like in 2020 and 2022, dozens of right-wing polls have been dumped into the marketplace in the last few weeks, 12 in Pennsylvania alone. Those polls then swing the polling averages to the right, making Trump look strong and Kamala Harris look stalled. Now, there are lots of explanations for why you'd want to game the polls. Entrepreneurial Republican pollsters can certainly gain favor with Trump, who's apparently fuming about Vice President Harris's billion-dollar fundraising and positive press. And then there's the more sinister explanation that if Trump, Republican pollsters, and even jittery Democrats convince enough people that his victory is inevitable, how much easier would it be to claim that the election was stolen if he loses? And how much easier would it be to get his base to rise up and maybe even get violent the way they did when he lost the last time? How much easier would it be to get the Republican House Speaker or John Roberts and the right-wing Supreme Court conservatives to throw the election to Trump? These are the things we need to consider, because Donald Trump is not running a normal election. He's talking America into damn near a civil war to terrify voters into supporting him. And if that doesn't work, he's laying the groundwork for Insurrection 2.0. I'm joined now by Ruth Ben-Ghiat, history professor at New York University, who writes about fascism and authoritarianism, and Stuart Stevens, chief strategist for Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign and senior advisor for the Lincoln Project. Thank you both for being here. Ruth, I want to start with you. Talk me down if I have overstated the case. And I just want to note for you, this is the case not just that I'm making, but that is being made to me by people outside the United States who are watching what's happening in the U.S. Have I overstated it?
No, you haven't. And I would actually go further than David Corn. Trump is not running a normal campaign. It's not just a disinformation campaign, although it is that. He's been running a radicalization campaign. I've been saying that ever since he showed up at Waco, Texas, to start his campaign at a white supremacist pilgrimage site, site of cult violence. That was a sign. Then he's visiting gun shops to look at, guns with his name on them. And so it's not hard to see that he's been running this kind of he's been conditioning Americans, and he's really been doing this since 2015 using his rallies, but particularly escalated now. He's conditioning Americans to see violence in a different light, which is what fascists do, which is what dictators do, as something that is sometimes necessary and even patriotic, which is why he calls the thugs who assaulted Capitol Police on January 6th as patriots. So all of this is is being escalated now because he needs to get people into a state of existential fear. And that's why he's talking about the enemy within, because the heartland has to be threatened, and he's dehumanizing them and sowing disgust and contempt for non-white people and immigrants. And all of this has to be ratcheted up so that he can get people into the state to perhaps follow him into violence if he loses.
Right. I mean, the thing about it is, Stuart, I've been around a long time, and I used to do campaigns when I wasn't in the media side. Nothing like this is a campaign, because normally campaigns are about addition. It's about trying to get more people into your camp to vote for you. He's not doing that. He's essentially simply let me just give you Kamala Harris's version of it. Here she is asking the question of what Trump is doing. Here's Vice President Harris.
He refuses to release his medical records. He is unwilling to do a 60 Minutes interview. He is unwilling to meet for a second debate.